We now have the largest mass shooting in American history happening overnight. A gunman on the 32nd floor of the Mandalay Bay Resort and Casino in Vegas opened fire on a packed outdoor music festival. The reports are now over 50 people dead and more than 200 wounded. 400 plus people reportedly going to hospitals in Vegas. They are literally overwhelmed. And the shooter, 64-year-old Stephen Paddock, shot and killed by police, a nearby resident. He'd been known to police for some time. We don't know any more than that. And you think about this, Jason Aldean had just taken the stage as a headliner for this country music festival, obviously in the open air, in the shadows of the Mandalay Casino. And this guy waited until it was at maximum capacity, and people were engaged in the headlining act and Jason Aldean. And literally within, I would say, and seeing the video, maybe 15 to 30 seconds into his first song, you can hear shots fired, at which point there was a pause. People were going, what was that? And then there were more gunfire. Jason Aldean left the stage, and that's when people realized that they were literally like a fish in a barrel at that point. And it's some of the video coming out and some of the stills are absolutely horrific. In just looking at the amount of damage and devastation there. And I think one of the questions that are probably being raised right now, other than the motive for this whole thing, is how we see someone with what appears to be a fully automatic weapon opening fire in a crowd. How do you have access to something that a lot of people believe only the military should have? Emily Taylor is a former prosecutor, also a Second Amendment attorney with U.S. Law Shield and uslawshield.com. Emily, good morning.
Good morning.
Nevada is very gun-friendly. There's a huge tourism industry in Nevada. People from other countries will travel where their gun laws are not as liberal as ours are, will come here to shoot, to go to firing ranges. I have a good friend that annually goes out and trains out there. They have ranges that have semi and fully automatic weapons available as well. And I think that's something that's going to be thrown about and what the facts are relative to fully automatic weapons. Again, we don't know for sure, but boy, it sure sounds like he was like bump firing this thing. Sounded like a large caliber, fully automatic weapon. What's the legality of those things in the United States?
Sure. And, it does sound, of course, law enforcement hasn't confirmed that yet, but if you're listening to the audio and you have any familiarity with firearms, the staccato of a full auto is unmistakable, and It sure does sound like a fully automatic weapon. That makes this a really of course, this is tragic in the loss of life, but the presence of the fully auto is also incredibly unique in this mass shooter situation because of how difficult legally it is to get your hands on one. We have go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. I said yes. There's something like it's federally regulated, right? Who can control these things?
Yes. So we have two issues at play here. One is that no one is allowed to sell to the general public a fully automatic firearm that was manufactured after 1986. So all of the fully automatic firearms that are owned by civilians in the general public are pre-1986 firearms. So that's issue number one. Issue number two is that machine guns are regulated under the National Firearms Act, as are suppressors. We have a host of other items that fall into this category in which the person who wants to own a machine gun has to essentially petition the federal government. They've got to send out fingerprints. They have to notify their chief law enforcement officer in their county, and the federal government will take 6 months to a year, sometimes even more, to approve the ownership of this item. Not to mention that because machine guns are so rare, they cost anywhere from $15,000 and up. So it really is, it's quite remarkable to see an item like this used in a mass shooting.
And furthermore, Emily, and I may be wrong about this, I believe that the cost for a license to have one of these weapons is something in the range of $20,000.
That's the cost of the weapon itself.
Okay,
yes.
okay.
The tax stamp that the federal government issues is just a little over $200.
Okay.
And then, of course, people tend to own these items through trust. The trust will cost you a couple $100 as well. But, yes, the grand total is really astronomical.
Yeah, there's nothing more controlled. So typically that's why you see these guns for hire, right, in a sense that you can't take them with you or rent them at a gun range. So people will go and go, wow, I get to fire a fully automatic weapon, which very few people have the opportunity to do outside of the military, will go and fire these at ranges in and around Nevada, which makes it a huge tourism destination. But those rifles are well taken care of. They're controlled. They have to remain in that environment. So there's a lot of questions as to how this guy was able to get one and then use it in this capacity.
Yes, that is, I think that's the question at hand, because you must have almost a spectacular background in order to have one of these items. And in fact, you hear people saying, well, you can modify firearms to make them fully automatic, but actually the possession of nothing but that, it's called a sear, is what modifies the firearm to make it dischargeable, multiple rounds for one trigger pull. It's actually the possession of the sear itself that's criminalized under the National Firearms Act. So you could have nothing more but this little piece of metal in your possession, and you would still have to have jumped through all of the background hoops in order to get it.
Because that's the part integral to the full auto versus the semi, and to explain the difference, once again, a semi-automatic weapon, every time you pull the trigger, one round will come out, and it's automatic, whereas as long as I hold the trigger on a fully automatic weapon, rounds will continue to come out of the muzzle until the magazine is completely empty, which could be a lot of rounds. Now, it sounds like, too, that this guy was reloading and doing so rather quickly, so he had multiple magazines, he had firepower, and again, we're talking about the shooting in Vegas with Emily Taylor, former prosecutor. She's an attorney specialized in the Second Amendment with U.S. Law Shield. And the big question is going to be how this guy got this weapon. And I'm sure there's also going to be call for legislation, as each and every time we have a mass shooting, you hear about assault weapons and the like. As I recall, Nevada, there are no assault weapon laws there, no magazine capacity restrictions as they called for following what happened out in Connecticut and elsewhere. So I'm sure that that's going to come back into play. How does the magazine restriction, capacity restriction fit in this whole thing?
Well, that is something that is becoming increasingly popular in firearm restrictive states. I suppose that it is just like California's, I believe they call it a bullet button. It's a on your magazine release, so that you can't even change magazines. In addition, there's a magazine limit, but you can't even change your magazine without a special tool or the tip of a bullet, which would release the magazine. So it's essentially you're slower in changing, in reloading and changing your magazines. Right. That is, something that does come up here. It's to be honest with you, it's not something that I am in favor of as someone who looks at gun laws and the Second Amendment on a regular basis. It's, at a certain point, we have this preserved Second Amendment right. And there's only so much you can do to stop bad people from doing bad things. If this man didn't have access to firearms, you can imagine that he would, get a pressure cooker and some nails and perhaps create an improvised explosive device in order to do the same thing, cause death and terror.
As we saw in Atlanta Olympic Park bombing.
Exactly. And, we have, in order to not sweep up the Second Amendment right of everyone else in this country, there is only so much legislation you can put into place, and bad people are going to do bad things with whatever tools they have available.
You'll hear that, though, and I'm sure that's going to be one of the, as this gets hotly debated here probably started the minute this thing happened, because this is an issue that's always polarizing, and almost instantly so thereafter a tragedy like this is like, well, isn't there something more that can be done about this to prevent something like this happening in the future without curtailing rights? But that's what you're talking about. As an attorney, is like there's only so much you can do, so much flexibility in the Second Amendment itself, because it is a constitutional right. You can only poke and probe and malate that putty so much before you start restricting constitutional rights, which is a no-go area.
That's exactly right. And, of course, we do allow regulation on the Second Amendment. Felons can't possess firearms. You can't possess under a certain age. We have lots of restrictions that has been upheld as constitutional and lawful on the Second Amendment. But at a certain point, you have crossed a threshold, and you simply do not sweep up the constitutional rights of all members of this country to control a group of bad apples. That's not how our law and our and our country works.
Yeah, Emily, the other thing, too, is this guy was known to police. Now, I don't know if generally, if you're known to police, you've had encounters with them, generally not good. And in this case, I'm wondering if this guy had prior felony records, how he was able to get the most restricted weapon in the United States.
And there are conflicting reports coming out about that. I've heard on some outlets that he has no criminal history, and of course now they're reporting that he was known to police, although I'm not quite sure what that means.
Yeah, it could be anything, right?
It could be anything. Bear in mind that just the simple possession of a firearm is unlawful if you have any felony conviction or a misdemeanor conviction of domestic violence. And there are lots of mental health issues that are disqualifying for purchasing and possessing firearms as well. If he had ever been adjudicated as being mentally defective, there are many, many things that can stop your possession of a firearm, and that's before we even start talking about, licensing for carry, and before we start talking about the NFA and tax stamps, and there are many, many checks that people go through.
Yeah. Emily Taylor, former prosecutor, Second Amendment attorney. She's with U.S. Law Shield, uslawshield.com, as we talk about the tragedy in Vegas this morning. And that's the other element here is this is going to be used to try and restrict rights in the future. There's going to be tremendous pushback from the NRA. And I don't think anything changes on this issue despite this huge mass killing. As someone who's a Second Amendment guy, gun owner myself, a responsible gun owner at that, I also look at, okay, is there anything else we can do on the gun owner end to prevent things like this from happening? But as you said, you're talking about such a specialized weapon that very, 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 very few people have access to. I mean, I've shot fully auto a couple times, but it was a very controlled environment. And not only that, I think there's another thing here too, and that is now we're in the age of 3D printing where people can print their own parts for everything, including weapons too. So, what if you buy a semi-auto and buy a kit for this thing? You can even modify could you modify a bolt action rifle to make it fully auto? This is like the brave new world because of this.
It is. And, bear in mind that if someone were to do that, they would be in violation of federal law. They'd be committing a federal felony. In most states, they would be committing a felony on the state level as well. But, if you're willing to break the law and kill people, you're probably also willing to break the law in other ways.
Yeah.
But again, I think that it's something we need to be very careful with when talking about how to craft restriction around this issue, because let's take the Sandy Hook shooting. I think that it's a wonderful example of just the lengths to which criminals will go to get their hands on firearms, to get their hands on any sort of weapon that when they're hell-bent on committing crime. The Sandy Hook shooter actually killed his mother in order to get access to her firearms and then go on his killing spree. Restricting the rights of law-abiding gun owners like yourself, like me, does not stop the criminal element from creating mass death and mass destruction. And so that's, I think, the thing that I wish people would keep in mind in the face of what is really a horrific moment in our nation's history, is that, if a criminal element like in Sandy Hook is willing, if they're willing to kill their family to get access to guns, they'll do anything. Whereas people like us, people who are law-abiding, are the only ones who are truly abiding by and thus suffering the negative effects of those restrictive gun laws.
Yeah, and I get it. And there's going to be people going, "Well, this is outrageous that you're claiming to be a victim in this whole thing." Both your guest and you, Sloaney. And yeah, I understand. I don't want to come off like that, because I look at it and go, "Is there anything else as law-abiding and within realms of the Constitution that we can do to protect people and prevent lunatics from doing what happened again in Las Vegas?" And I would look at the federal firearm application. When I go in, if I go in and you go in and we buy a weapon, you fill the card out. It asks for your address and your social. You check all the boxes off saying I was never convicted of a felony. I'm not in a mental state. I haven't been treated by a psychological professional, anything along those lines, drugs, et cetera, et cetera. You turn that card in. They call it in. The FBI does the instant background check, and within a few minutes, you know if you're allowed to take that weapon with you when you leave. That's in a perfect world. But, I look at that application and go, if I'm hell-bent on hurting people, or if I'm crazy, most crazy people don't know they're crazy. Most crazy people won't admit they're crazy. They think there's a conspiracy by the government to plant chips in their head and everything. They think they're normal and the rest of the world's messed up. Is there any way to solve that?
Well, there are good ways and there are bad ways. The checks that we have in place right now tend to function quite well when it comes to mental illness, mental health. There are states out there who create very restrictive laws that I personally think are unconstitutional and a violation of due process. But I'll tell you what their solution is. The solution in places like California, Connecticut are essentially what they call mental health. What are they? They're mental health firearms confiscation orders at their basic level. And what this does is allow people who have some sort of relationship with an individual to petition the court to say, I think that they're a danger to themselves or others. Please go in and confiscate all of their guns.
Right.
Now, that might on its surface sound like a good idea when you can say, oh, this person is, walking around, he's got paranoid delusions, we need to get his guns away from him. Sure, I don't think there's anyone in the world who would argue against something like that. But when you can walk into a courtroom, make a vague allegation against another person that they are dangerous, and have a judge sign an order that says the police are allowed to waltz into that person's home and confiscate every gun they own without an opportunity to respond, it is a violation of both substantive and procedural due process, and it is it has the potential to sweep up and to, I know that we don't want to come off as victims here. I understand.
Yeah, I totally get what you're saying. Is you don't want to, in a case like that, it's like, listen, we know someone's dangerous, someone is mentally ill, and yet they have weapons, and we need to segregate those things immediately as possible. However, you still can't circumvent constitutional law. You can't violate someone's due process simply based on a hunch or quarter. You have to have substantial proof of that, and that's the country that we live in. Like it or not, that's how the rules are.
Exactly, and it is because, unfortunately, to protect the masses, we let things slip through the cracks because the alternative is worse. I like to liken it to drunk driving. Just because, I live in Harris County, it's Houston, Texas, it has one of the highest instances of drunk driving and drunk driving fatalities in the whole country. Right. Does that mean that every resident of Harris County has their car taken away from them, or there's a curfew imposed on all of us because there are many, many drunk drivers here? No, of course not, because that would, though it would save lives, certainly it would violate the rights of the vast majority of law-abiding people.
Yeah. Well, look at the hoops people have to jump through to get an elderly family member to take their keys away from them when it comes to dementia and the like. Anyway, Emily, and that's not a constitutionally protected right to drive. Emily Taylor, former prosecutor, Second Amendment attorney, U.S. Law Shield. Thanks again, Emily. Great stuff. I really appreciate you coming on this morning.